Be very careful with what you try to control today night, because the real challenge may not arrive in the form you expect. Sunday, August 16th. Mars and Pluto will enter one of the most psychologically demanding configurations of the entire year, and the tension may feel strangely personal, as though something inside you is being pushed toward a decision you have been avoiding for weeks. The aspect is a quincunx, an angle of 150 degrees that traditional astrologers associated with aversion. It describes two planetary forces that do not naturally understand one another, two energies operating from completely different worlds, yet somehow forced into contact. Mars wants movement, action, defense, and immediate response, while Pluto works beneath the surface, exposing what has been buried and transforming what can no longer remain unchanged. When these forces meet through a quincunx, the discomfort is often difficult to name because the conflict does not announce itself in an obvious way. You may simply feel that something is wrong. You may wake up carrying an unexplained heaviness, become unusually impatient, or notice that ordinary situations suddenly feel much more significant than they normally would. Then comes the part that makes this sequence even more important. Less than 7 hours later, on Monday morning, Mars will form an exact square with Neptune, and the energy you try to push forward through force, pressure, control, or determination can begin to dissolve beneath you. This is why the story is not really about one isolated transit. It is about the movement from pressure into surrender, from forcing into uncertainty, and from believing that you can command the outcome into discovering that some outcomes cannot be commanded at all. Perhaps you have already noticed strange sensations of heaviness in your body during these past days. Perhaps your jaw has been tightening without you realizing it. Perhaps there has been pressure across your chest. Or perhaps there has been a persistent knot in your stomach that refuses to disappear no matter how much you try to relax. In an astrological interpretation, these sensations can feel connected to the emotional tension surrounding this period, but they should not be treated as proof of an astrological cause or as a substitute for medical care. What matters for this story is the deeper question your body may seem to be asking you. What are you still fighting internally, even when you tell yourself that everything is fine? Stay with me because, before today arrives, you need to understand what brought this moment into existence. The most important part of this week is not the event everyone is watching. It is the emotional fracture that happened before it. 4 days earlier, on August 12th, there was a total solar eclipse in Leon. In the symbolic language of astrology, an eclipse is often described as a moment when familiar structures become unstable and hidden material rises toward awareness. This was not simply a beautiful spectacle in the sky. Within the spiritual interpretation of this story, it represented demolition. Imagine a structure you have spent years constructing, layer after layer, not necessarily because it reflected who you truly were, but because it helped you survive, gain approval, avoid rejection, or appear strong when you were actually uncertain inside. Then imagine that structure suddenly developing cracks. The eclipse symbolically brought attention to every false identity you had been carrying, every mask you had learned to wear in order to receive acceptance, and every version of yourself that existed more for other people's expectations than for your own authentic existence. If something inside you seemed to break during this week, something you could not easily explain, this astrological framework would interpret that feeling as part of the eclipse's deeper symbolic process. You were being exposed to yourself. The protective layers were coming away. The version of you that knew how to perform, please, impress, and maintain appearances could no longer feel as secure as before. And that can be deeply uncomfortable because most people do not realize how much emotional energy goes into maintaining an identity that no longer fits. You can spend years convincing yourself that you are calm when you are actually afraid. You can call something loyalty when underneath it there is fear of abandonment. You can call something ambition when beneath it there is a desperate need to prove your worth. You can call something patience when you are actually terrified of losing control. The eclipse symbolically placed those contradictions under a brighter light. It left you emotionally exposed before you had time to rebuild the walls that once protected you. That is why the arrival of Mars matters so much. Mars is now moving directly into the vulnerable territory the eclipse has opened. Instead of giving you time to reconstruct your defenses, it activates the most instinctive and primitive parts of your psychological response. It can press directly against the insecurities that have just been revealed. And when that happens, your first impulse may be to do something, anything, that gives you the sensation of control again. You may want to send the message. You may want to demand the answer. You may want to confront the person. You may want to fix the situation immediately. You may want to force certainty into a situation that does not yet contain certainty. That instinct is the heart of the trap. The deeper lesson of this astrological sequence is not whether you can fight harder. It is whether you can recognize the moment when fighting harder is no longer the answer. Mars entered Cancer on August the 11th, and that placement is essential to understanding what happens this weekend. Mars represents action, aggression, initiative, movement, courage, and the instinct to advance toward a target. Mars is most comfortable when it can act directly, clearly, and decisively, but Cancer operates through feeling, protection, memory, attachment, sensitivity, and emotional security. In Cancer, Mars does not move like a warrior charging straight across an open battlefield. Symbolically, it moves more like a crab, sideways, indirect, defensive, emotionally reactive, and constantly aware of what might threaten its sense of safety. In traditional astrology, Cancer is the sign where Mars is considered to be in fall. This means the qualities Mars naturally prefers are not expressed with the same ease here. Instead of acting simply because something is strategically correct, the impulse can become entangled with emotion. Instead of asking what makes the most logical sense, you may find yourself asking what makes you feel safe. Those are not the same question, and the difference between them can become enormous during a period like this. Think about the decisions you have made during this week. Think about the moments when you reacted quickly, withdrew suddenly, became protective, or felt an urgent need to defend yourself. How much of that response came from clear strategy, and how much came from an old emotional wound being touched? Mars in Cancer is not primarily fighting for victory. In this symbolic interpretation, it is fighting for protection. It protects the vulnerable places inside you, especially the places the eclipse has just exposed. That is the emotional current moving directly into today's configuration, and Pluto will be waiting there. At 11 o'clock today night, Mars at 3 degrees of Cancer will form an exact quincunx with Pluto at 3 degrees of Aquarius. This is where the discomfort becomes much harder to ignore. Most people understand the basic symbolism of squares and oppositions because those aspects tend to feel obvious. A square can feel like friction. An opposition can feel like confrontation between two clearly visible sides. You know something is happening because the conflict is loud enough to demand your attention. A quincunx is different. Its disturbance can be subtle precisely because you may not recognize the source immediately. Traditional astrologers describe this relationship through the concept of aversion. Two planets separated by 150 degrees do not share the same element, the same modality, or the same polarity. They operate according to different rules and speak in symbolic languages that do not naturally translate into one another. Yet they are still forced into interaction. That creates the possibility of a profound blind spot. You can feel the tension in your relationships, your thoughts, your reactions, and your emotional state, while remaining completely uncertain about where the pressure is actually coming from. You may decide that your partner is the problem. You may blame your work. You may focus on the person who has not given you the answer you have been waiting for. You may believe that one external circumstance is responsible for the discomfort building inside you. But the deeper issue, according to this astrological framework, may be hidden underneath those visible circumstances. And when you cannot identify the real source of your distress, the mind naturally searches for something it can blame. This is where psychological projection can become powerful. A small disagreement can suddenly feel enormous. A delayed message can begin to look like evidence of betrayal. A minor inconvenience at work can seem to confirm that everything is working against you. The emotional reaction becomes larger than the event itself because the event has touched something older and deeper. You are no longer responding only to what is happening in front of you. You are responding to everything that the moment reminds you of. This is the shadow of the Mars-Pluto quincunx in the story being told here. It can make ordinary situations feel threatening and make control feel like the only available form of protection. The more uncertain you feel, the more desperately you may try to force certainty. The more afraid you become of losing something, the tighter you may hold it. The more exposed you feel, the more aggressively you may attempt to defend yourself. Yet the very effort to control everything can create the exhaustion you were trying to avoid. This is why your physical experience may seem so closely connected to the emotional atmosphere of the week. In symbolic astrology, Mars is associated with muscles, activation, adrenaline, and the instinctive response to pressure. Pluto represents deep processes, hidden transformation, elimination, and everything occurring beneath conscious awareness. Cancer, the sign Mars is currently moving through, is traditionally associated with the stomach, chest, and emotional interior. Within the symbolic language of astrology, when these forces collide through an aspect that is difficult for the conscious mind to process, the body becomes part of the story. You might notice sudden waves of discomfort, tension while sleeping, a clenched jaw, or shoulders that feel as though they are carrying an invisible burden. Again, these experiences can have many ordinary causes, and physical symptoms should always be taken seriously rather than automatically attributed to astrology. But emotionally, the metaphor is powerful. Your body can sometimes reveal the pressure you have been mentally negotiating long before you are ready to admit what is happening. You may tell yourself that you are fine, while your body remains tense. You may insist that you have moved on while your reactions tell a different story. You may say that you do not care, while every unanswered message changes your mood. The symbolic lesson is not that the universe is medically controlling your body. The lesson is that emotional tension can become difficult to hide when the protective identity you have built begins to crack. Your nervous system may feel as though it is preparing for a battle that your conscious mind has not yet fully identified. In that sense, the image of tectonic plates shifting beneath your feet becomes especially meaningful. The surface can appear stable while something deeper is already moving. And if you have been feeling that strange internal pressure all week, the invitation is not to panic. It is to pay attention. Ask yourself what you are trying so desperately to control. Ask what you fear would happen if you stopped pushing. Ask whether the thing you are defending is truly your future or simply an old wound that has learned to call itself protection. Because how you respond to day-night matters within this story. You can move through the intensity by becoming even more rigid, or you can recognize the moment when the need to force an outcome is itself creating the greatest pressure. And this becomes even more important because the following morning changes the entire equation. At 6 o'clock Monday morning, less than 7 hours after the peak of the quincunx, Mars will form an exact square with Neptune in Aries. This is the part that can completely change the meaning of what happens the night before. Everyone may be focused on Mars and Pluto, but the aftermath is where the real lesson emerges. Imagine spending the evening trying to force a door open, convinced that everything depends on getting through it immediately. You push harder, you argue, you demand an answer, you manipulate the circumstances. You attempt to bend reality toward the outcome you have already decided must happen. Then morning arrives, and suddenly the door no longer seems to lead where you thought it did. That is the symbolic atmosphere of the Mars-Neptune square. It is often associated with the collision between action and uncertainty, determination and illusion, effort and dissolution. What appeared solid can begin to look less certain. What you believed was fact may reveal itself to have been assumption. What you interpreted as victory may lose its meaning once the emotional intensity fades. The image of a foggy battlefield captures this symbolism well. You may still have the desire to move forward, but visibility is compromised. You may possess enormous emotional force, but you cannot clearly see where that force is taking you. This is why forcing an outcome to day-night can become so important within the narrative of this transit. If you provoke a confrontation, demand a response, attempt to manipulate a situation, or insist on making reality obey your immediate wishes, The following morning may expose how little control you actually had over the outcome. The symbolism is not that the universe is punishing you, it is that reality can become impossible to dominate when the information you are acting on is incomplete. Neptune dissolves certainty. Mars wants certainty through action. When those impulses collide, the harder you push without clarity, the more likely you are to discover that your effort was built upon something you misunderstood. This is the deepest psychological turning point. The question is not whether you are strong enough to fight. The question is whether you are wise enough to recognize when your urge to fight is coming from fear rather than truth. Today night may therefore confront you with a choice between reaction and awareness, between forcing and observing, between defending an identity that has already begun to fall away and allowing yourself to discover what remains when the performance is no longer necessary. The eclipse opened the wound in the story. Mars in Cancer brings your protective instincts directly into that exposed territory. Mars and Pluto then create the psychological pressure point, and less than 7 hours later, Mars and Neptune bring uncertainty into the picture. That sequence is what makes this period feel like more than a single astrological event. It becomes a progression from exposure to defense to confrontation, and finally to the realization that control has limits. If you can recognize that pattern before you act, you may understand the difference between responding from an old wound and responding from the person you are becoming. And that is exactly where the next part of this story begins, because once the fog arrives, the question is no longer what you can force into existence, but what remains when the force finally disappears. What happens after the Mars-Pluto tension may be even more important than the confrontation itself, because the moment you realize that the argument, the ultimatum, or the plan you tried to force was never addressing the real issue, you may finally understand where your energy has been disappearing. You could look back at a disagreement and suddenly recognize that you were defending a position built from emotion rather than reality. You could examine an ultimatum you delivered and realize that it came from fear, not certainty. You could revisit a plan you pushed into existence and discover that the foundation beneath it was never as solid as you believed. And this is where the Mars-Neptune square becomes so significant within the story of this weekend. The danger is not simply that an outcome disappears. The deeper danger is that the effort required to force that outcome can consume your own vitality. Trying to overpower circumstances under this kind of energy is like striking against water and expecting the water to surrender. You can put enormous strength into the motion, but the force disappears into something you cannot hold. Eventually, you are left exhausted, disoriented, and wondering why something that felt so urgent suddenly seems impossible to understand. That is why the guidance for this period needs to be treated as more than casual advice. It is a way of moving through the energy without allowing the pressure to consume you. The first thing to release is the demand for immediate resolution. Not permanently, not forever, and not because the issue does not matter. Simply release the requirement that everything must be settled right now, today, or this weekend. There may be something unresolved in your life that has been occupying your thoughts for far too long. Perhaps there is a conversation waiting to happen. Perhaps a decision has been hanging over you. Perhaps there is a situation that has remained uncertain for so long that the uncertainty itself has become exhausting. You may feel an almost physical urge to finish it. Obtain the answer, make the call, send the message, demand the explanation, or force the final conversation simply so you can breathe again. But look more closely at that urgency. What if the need for closure is not actually clarity? What if it is anxiety wearing the clothing of productivity? What if your mind has convinced you that waiting means weakness, that uncertainty means you have lost control, and that immediate action is the only proof that you are still powerful? That is the illusion you need to recognize. With Mars moving through Cancer, emotional insecurity can become attached to the decision-making process so quietly that you may not realize fear is sitting behind your choices. You may believe you are acting because the moment requires action, when in reality you are acting because remaining still feels unbearable. There is a profound difference between those two motivations. One comes from clarity, the other comes from discomfort, and the astrology of this period asks you to recognize which one is actually speaking through you. Neptune is already part of the approaching picture, which means the information you believe you possess may not be complete. The emotional truth you think you are reading inside another person may actually be your own fear reflected back at you. The certainty you feel about what must happen may be connected to the survival instincts activated by Pluto rather than to a clear understanding of what is actually unfolding. This is why releasing the timing matters. You are not surrendering your future. You are not abandoning your needs. You are simply refusing to force an answer while the atmosphere is clouded. The answers can still arrive. They simply do not need to be dragged into existence through pressure. Sometimes clarity appears only after the internal struggle becomes quiet. There is an irony hidden inside this transit. The moment you stop gripping the situation with all your strength may be the moment the situation finally becomes visible. The moment you stop demanding that another person respond in exactly the way you need may be the moment you understand what their behavior has actually been telling you. The moment you stop insisting that an outcome must happen according to your schedule may be the moment you discover what was underneath your desperation all along. Clarity does not always arrive in the middle of the storm. Sometimes it becomes recognizable only after the storm has passed. So if the emotional pressure becomes overwhelming to day-night, do not immediately send the message, make the confrontation, or attempt to settle the issue. Let the energy move through your body instead. Stretch. Breathe deeply. Move your body. Put physical order around you by organizing a drawer, clearing a shelf, or arranging your workspace. Give the intensity somewhere to go that does not require another person to cooperate with you and does not demand a major decision from you. The goal is not to suppress the emotion. The goal is to stop turning emotional intensity into irreversible action. There is another form of control that this transit may expose, and it can be much more difficult to admit because it involves another person. If you are completely honest with yourself, there may be someone in your life right now whose behavior you are trying to influence. Perhaps you are doing it subtly, through a carefully chosen message designed to steer a conversation toward the answer you want. Perhaps the strategy is more obvious, through an emotional ultimatum, guilt, withdrawal of affection, or deliberate distance intended to make someone feel the consequences of not responding to your expectations. Mars and Pluto together symbolize intense struggles around power, but Mars in Cancer can disguise that struggle beneath the language of care. Instead of openly declaring that you need someone to behave differently so that you can feel secure, you may say that you are only doing something because you care. You may frame your control as protection. You may explain your pressure as concern. You may convince yourself that you are helping because the alternative feels too frightening. Yet beneath that protective language can exist a much more vulnerable statement. I need you to behave in a certain way because I need to feel safe. That distinction matters enormously. Today-night, the desire to tighten your grip on another person may become especially strong. It could involve a partner, a family member, a friend, or even a colleague. You may notice them changing. You may sense them becoming more independent. You may feel them moving away from the role you expected them to occupy. You may see them make choices that do not match the version of them you had built inside your mind. Under the pressure of the quincunx, that change can feel much larger than ordinary discomfort. It can feel threatening to your emotional security itself. Their independence can begin to resemble rejection. Their silence can resemble abandonment. Their freedom can feel like something being taken away from you. But Pluto in Aquarius brings a different demand into the picture. Freedom matters. Not only your freedom, but theirs. Pluto in Aquarius does not support emotional imprisonment. It does not bend simply because guilt is applied. It does not respond well to manipulation. When you attempt to control another person under this influence, the response may be intense resistance or something even more final, emotional detachment. And then Monday morning brings Neptune into the story. Whatever you believed you accomplished through pressure may suddenly look different. The truth you thought you extracted from someone by cornering them may turn out to have been an answer designed to escape the pressure rather than an honest expression of what they truly felt. The agreement you obtain through emotional force may carry resentment underneath it, and that resentment can return later in a form you never anticipated. This is why the real transformation of power is not about gaining power over another person. It is about having the courage to ask yourself why their freedom frightens you so deeply. That question reaches the wound beneath the behavior. That is what the quincunx is attempting to reveal within this interpretation. If you refuse to look at that fear, controlling someone else will never remove it. It will only strengthen it. There is an even deeper layer to this process, and this may be the part you resist most strongly. You may need to stop forcing an older version of yourself to remain alive. 4 days ago, the total solar eclipse in Leon symbolically dismantled something deep within you. You may have experienced that as a quiet collapse, a strange realization that something you once pursued no longer excites you in the same way. Or it may have arrived like a sudden blow, an unexpected recognition that the life you have been building does not necessarily belong to the person you are becoming. The identity you created, the ambitions you chose, and the definition of success you exhausted yourself trying to achieve may have been inherited from expectations that were never truly yours. Perhaps you built that identity because approval once felt necessary. Perhaps you learned to measure your worth through achievement. Perhaps you became committed to impressing people who may no longer even be watching. The eclipse exposed that possibility. Now Mars in Cancer can attempt to pull you backward toward what feels familiar. Cancer does not only symbolize home and family in this reading. It also represents attachment to the past. It can hold tightly to what is known simply because what is known feels safer than what has not yet been defined. Even when the familiar environment is slowly suffocating you, the emotional instinct can still whisper that returning to it is safer than stepping into uncertainty. This is where the Mars-Pluto quincunx becomes a confrontation between the instinct to preserve and the deeper need to transform. You may feel frustrated because your efforts do not seem to produce the results you expected. The promotion does not arrive. The project does not move forward. The recognition you believed you had earned remains out of reach. Your first instinct may be to push harder. You may tell yourself that you simply need more discipline, more effort, more persistence, more pressure, more proof. You may decide to double down on the identity that once produced validation. But what if the blocked path is not blocked because you are incapable? What if the resistance is revealing that the goal belongs to a version of you that the eclipse has already symbolically buried? You may be attempting to revive something that has already completed its purpose. Forcing it back into existence will not necessarily restore it. It may only drain you further and postpone your ability to recognize what is actually emerging. This discomfort is not necessarily a punishment. Within the symbolic language of this transit, it is not proof that you failed. It is the discomfort of becoming someone you have not fully met yet. Growth can feel like loss when the identity you are leaving behind once gave you a sense of certainty. You may grieve old ambitions. You may miss the version of yourself who knew exactly what to chase. You may even feel embarrassed that something you worked so hard for no longer feels meaningful. But you are allowed to mourn what is ending. You are allowed to acknowledge that an old dream once mattered deeply to you. What you are being asked to release is not the memory of that dream. It is the attempt to force that dream into a life that has already changed around you. Let the old ambitions rest. Allow yourself to feel what that ending means. Do not turn grief into another reason to fight, because the weeks following this transit may begin to reveal something different. Something you could not have designed through pressure alone. Something that does not need to be chased because it is connected to a direction that is emerging naturally. This brings us to the deeper alchemy of surrender. Today night is not fundamentally about who can demonstrate the greatest strength. It is not a contest of endurance. It is not about proving who can push the hardest or hold on the longest. It is about surrender in its strongest form. True surrender is not weakness. It requires extraordinary courage to stand in the middle of uncertainty, feel the pressure building inside you, recognize the desperation rising, and consciously decide not to act from it. The Mars-Pluto quincunx represents fire in this symbolic story. It burns through the illusions of control that you have used to protect yourself. The Mars-Neptune square represents water. It washes over what remains and leaves you face to face with what is authentic. If you allow the process to unfold instead of fighting every sensation it creates, the transit can symbolically strip away the need to manipulate, force, perform, or control in order to feel powerful. The people who surrender to this energy are not the people who give up on their lives. They are the people who understand that not every impulse deserves an immediate response. They are the people who can feel the urge to fight and still choose stillness. They are the people who may wake Monday morning with their vitality preserved, instead of scattered across battles that never needed to happen. They are the people who may emerge from the confusion with a kind of clarity that could not have been reached through pressure. They begin to understand that real power was never about controlling every person or circumstance surrounding them. It was about learning to govern the world within themselves. Those who continue forcing everything may wake exhausted and confused, wondering why the thing they fought so hard to obtain suddenly feels empty. They may discover that the victory they imagined would bring relief has no emotional taste at all. And that is the choice placed before you. You can continue gripping what is already changing, or you can recognize the message hidden inside the resistance. You can demand that the old version remain, or you can allow the old version to finish its purpose. You can attempt to control another person, or you can face the fear that makes their freedom feel threatening. You can force resolution through uncertainty, or you can give clarity enough space to find you. The universe, within the symbolic language of this transit, has already made its preference clear. This is not merely another planetary movement to observe from a distance. It represents a threshold between one way of responding and another. By Monday, the difference may become impossible to ignore. You will see more clearly what happens when you fight every uncertainty and what becomes possible when you stop spending your life force trying to dominate what cannot be dominated. If you have stayed with this message until this point, thank you sincerely for giving your attention to this journey. If this message resonated with something you are experiencing, consider subscribing so you can continue receiving more content like this. You are also welcome to share your own experiences and reflections in the comments, because sometimes putting your experience into words helps reveal what you could not see while you were living through it. Take care of yourself, stay aware of what your inner world is asking you to recognize, and I will see you again very soon.